He suggested that if Canada is going to get some kind of deal with the United States, that Canada needs to be prepared to accept a higher tariff rate.
Jameson Weir said again that the U.S. is not happy about provincial liquor stores banning their alcohol and those supply management protections.
If Canada wants to agree that we can have some level of higher tariff on them while they open up their markets, so things like dairy and other things.
Something shifted in the Canada-US relationship this week, and it did not come from where Washington was looking. The signal was not loud. It was not delivered at a press conference or through a formal diplomatic statement. It came through a pattern of decisions that, taken together, reveal a posture Washington appears to have underestimated. The assumption in Washington had been straightforward. Pressure applied at sufficient intensity produces concessions. That assumption is now being tested in ways that the administration did not appear to have planned for. And the response coming out of Ottawa is not what the pressure model was designed to encounter. To understand why this moment carries weight, it is necessary to revisit how the current trade tension escalated. Following renewed tariff discussions in Washington, the Trump administration signaled that any future trade arrangement with Canada would require Canada to accept structurally higher tariff rates as a baseline condition, not as a negotiating outcome. The message was transactional and direct. Market access would be conditional on economic concessions made up front before formal negotiations resumed. This framing matters because it reversed the traditional sequence of trade diplomacy. Normally, both parties enter a process, make reciprocal commitments, and arrive at terms through exchange. What Washington proposed was a precondition model: yield first, then talk. For a trading partner as deeply integrated into the U.S. economy as Canada, with roughly 75% of its exports historically directed southward, that kind of pressure carries real economic weight. Border-sensitive industries, agricultural exporters, and energy sector stakeholders all operate on timelines that do not accommodate prolonged uncertainty. Washington understood this. It had worked before. The Trump administration's trade strategy has followed a consistent internal logic across multiple negotiations. The structure is identifiable: impose asymmetric costs, allow economic pressure to surface domestic political friction in the target country, wait for that friction to generate a demand for resolution, then enter the final stage of negotiation from a position of declared strength. It is a pressure-to-concession sequence, and its effectiveness depends on one critical assumption: that the targeted partner has no credible alternative and cannot absorb the waiting period. In previous rounds of US-Canada trade friction, that assumption largely held. Canadian businesses raised alarms. Industry groups called for rapid resolution. Political pressure mounted on Ottawa to prioritize stability over posture. The deal, when it came, reflected the asymmetry and urgency. But here is what Washington did not anticipate. Canada did not panic. It did not rush delegations to Washington seeking exemptions. It did not signal that domestic pressure was becoming politically unmanageable. The response from Prime Minister Mark Carney was measured in tone and deliberate in direction, and that deliberateness is what makes this moment structurally different from prior rounds. Carney's government moved on several fronts simultaneously. On the trade diversification side, Ottawa accelerated engagement with Indo-Pacific partners, setting export growth targets in non-US markets measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars over the medium term. Trade missions were expanded into Southeast Asia and the Gulf region, with particular focus on Canadian agricultural exports, liquefied natural gas positioning, and critical minerals, sectors where global demand is rising and where Canada holds genuine supply-side leverage. On the manufacturing and industrial side, Canada deepened conversations with European Union counterparts around defense procurement and advanced industrial cooperation, frameworks that carry long-term supply chain implications, not just headline trade volumes. On energy, Canada began accelerating internal discussions about West Coast export infrastructure, a conversation that had stalled for years precisely because the US market had felt permanent enough to make alternatives seem unnecessary. Each of these moves, individually, could be read as routine diplomatic activity. Together, they represent a structural recalibration of Canada's economic center of gravity. This is not a reaction. This is a redesign. What makes this development particularly significant is the timing and the specificity of the numbers emerging from Ottawa. Canadian officials referenced concrete bilateral targets with India's expanding consumer economy, articulated partnership frameworks with Japan's advanced manufacturing sector, and signaled alignment conversations with Gulf sovereign wealth funds interested in Canadian resource and infrastructure. These are not aspirational statements. They represent active negotiating tracks, and they are moving on a timeline that compresses Washington's window for assuming Canada will simply wait for US terms to soften. When leverage is time-sensitive, and trade leverage almost always is, an opposing party that begins credibly filling the timeline with alternatives changes the geometry of the negotiation entirely. The rhetoric coming from Washington in response has notably sharpened in tone. When pressure does not produce the expected early signals of concession, the pressure instrument tends to escalate in volume rather than precision. That escalation in tone, rather than reflecting growing strength, may indicate the opposite, that the original mechanism is encountering unexpected resistance. To understand why this matters beyond the immediate trade dispute, it is worth recalling how deeply the US-Canada economic relationship was constructed over the past several decades. Supply chains were integrated at the component level. Energy infrastructure was built with cross-border dependency as a feature, not a risk. Defense procurement, financial exposure, and regulatory alignment all tilted heavily toward a single dominant partner. For Canada, this felt like stability. For decades it was. Assumption created exposure. Exposure created urgency. Urgency created action. What is now unfolding is not a political stunt or an emotional response to tariff pressure. It is the visible product of a calculation that has been running quietly inside Canadian economic policy circles for some time. That concentration of dependency in a single relationship, regardless of how historically stable that relationship appeared, represents structural vulnerability in a geopolitically volatile era. The uncomfortable question this raises for Washington is forward-looking. If Canada successfully absorbs short-term trade friction and emerges from this period with meaningfully diversified export channels and deeper strategic partnerships across Asia, the Gulf, and Europe, then the tariff instrument loses much of its precision. It transitions from a surgical tool, one that creates targeted pain to produce targeted concessions, into a blunt cost that falls on both sides of integrated supply chains and cross-border industries without delivering the political outcome it was designed to achieve. Recalibration, in that scenario, is no longer Canada's burden alone. Recalibration becomes a shared problem. This was never just about dairy quotas or industrial tariff schedules. It is about who sets the terms of economic partnership in a world where middle powers are no longer simply choosing between access and isolation. They are building third options. The question that will define the next chapter of this dispute is not whether Canada can withstand pressure. The question is whether a leverage model built for a less multipolar world still functions when the target country is quietly, methodically, and without drama, building the architecture of independence. That answer will carry consequences well beyond North America.